Innocent black man spends 20 years in prison for a crime he knew absolutely nothing about. Here's what happened. The air in the courtroom was heavy, filled with a suffocating tension. Rows of spectators sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between the young black man standing at the defendant's table and the imposing figure of Judge Walter Perkins. The judge's stern expression revealed no trace of doubt or mercy as he scanned the courtroom. Jamal Carter, his deep voice echoed through the chamber, "You have been found guilty of the murder of Michael Lawson." The evidence presented leaves no room for doubt in the eyes of this court. Jamal stood motionless, his hands clenched into tight fists. His brown eyes, filled with equal parts pain and defiance, swept over the courtroom. In the front row, his mother, Ruth Carter, trembled as she gripped a worn Bible, tears streaming down her face. She whispered a silent prayer, refusing to believe this was happening. On the other side of the courtroom, the victim's family sobbed quietly. Michael Lawson's mother clutched a framed photo of her son, her grief palpable. The prosecutor sat smugly at his table, his confidence unshaken. Jamal raised his voice, his words cutting through the heavy silence. "I didn't do this. I swear to God, I didn't kill that man. This is a mistake." Judge Perkins banged his gavel sharply, silencing Jamal's protest. "Mr. Carter, you will not disrupt this court," he snapped. The judge's cold glare bore into Jamal, but behind it lay a secret, a guilt so deeply buried it refused to surface. "Life in prison," Judge Perkins announced, his voice unwavering, without the possibility of parole. The gavel slammed against the block, sealing Jamal's fate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by muffled sobs. Ruth collapsed into her seat, clutching her chest, her breath ragged. Jamal turned to her, his voice breaking. "Mama, I didn't do it. You know I didn't." "I know, baby," she whispered, her words choked by tears. "I know." As two guards approached to escort Jamal out, he shot one last glance at the judge. His expression was not one of anger but of determination, as if silently vowing to prove the truth, no matter how long it took. Judge Perkins avoided his gaze, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he placed the gavel down. Beneath his composed exterior, a storm of guilt and fear churned, a storm that would eventually destroy everything he held dear. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Some doubted the verdict, others believed justice had been served. But for Ruth Carter and her son, the world had just shattered. The sound of the heavy courtroom doors closing behind Jamal felt like the final toll of a bell, marking the beginning of a long, dark chapter in his life. And somewhere, hidden deep within the heart of the Perkins family, a terrible secret began to stir, threatening to rise to the surface. Before we move on, let's see what led Mr. Carter to this situation. How the scandal all began. It was late at night, and the streets were eerily quiet. The soft hum of distant traffic mixed with the faint sound of crickets in the chilly air. Under the flickering streetlights of a wealthy neighborhood, Chris Perkins, Judge Walter Perkins' only son, stumbled out of a bar. His breath reeked of alcohol, and his privileged confidence was amplified by the night's drinks. Across the street, Darnell Harris, a local mechanic, was leaning against a wall, waiting for his ride home after a long shift. Chris spotted him and, for reasons even he wouldn't understand later, decided to approach. "You looking at me?" Chris slurred, his voice laced with drunken aggression. Darnell barely glanced up. "Nah, man. Just waiting for my bus." "Don't lie to me," Chris snapped, stepping closer. His entitled rage flared, unprovoked and dangerous. "Guys like you don't belong around here." Darnell's posture stiffened. "I don't want trouble, man. Just go home." But Chris wasn't in the mood to listen. An argument broke out, escalating quickly as Chris shoved Darnell. Words became shouts, and in a moment of drunken panic, Chris grabbed a nearby metal pipe. "Don't come at me," he shouted, his hands shaking. "Put that down," Darnell warned, backing up. "You're making a mistake." But Chris swung anyway. The pipe struck Darnell's head, and he collapsed instantly, his body lifeless on the cold pavement. Blood began to pool beneath him, spreading like a dark shadow. Chris froze, staring in horror. "Oh God, No, he whispered, his chest heaving as panic gripped him. He dropped the pipe, the metallic clang echoing in the night. Without another thought, Chris turned and ran. He didn't look back, leaving behind the life he had just taken, and the evidence that would soon destroy an innocent man's future. The morning after the crime, Chris sat on the edge of his bed, his hands trembling as last night's events replayed in his mind. The blood, the lifeless body, the sound of the pipe hitting the ground. It was all too much. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He couldn't keep it in any longer. His father, Judge Walter Perkins, sat at the dining table, sipping his morning coffee and reading the newspaper. Chris hesitated for a moment, then blurted out, "Dad, I need to tell you something. Something bad." Judge Perkins looked up from his paper, raising a skeptical brow. "What is it now, Chris? Another bar fight? A speeding ticket?" Chris shook his head violently. "It's worse than that," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Dad, I killed someone." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Perkins froze, his coffee cup suspended mid-air. "What did you just say?" Chris recounted the events of the previous night, his voice breaking as he admitted every detail. By the time he finished, Perkins' face was ashen. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His son, his only child, had committed murder. The scandal alone would ruin them. "You idiot," Perkins hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Do you have any idea what this could do to me? To our family?" Chris buried his face in his hands. "I panicked. I didn't mean for it to happen, Dad. I don't know what to do." For a long moment, the judge said nothing, his sharp mind piecing together a plan. He had spent decades mastering the legal system, bending it to his will. Now, he would use it to protect his son. "You're not going to prison," Perkins said firmly, his voice cold and calculating. "We'll make sure someone else takes the fall for this." Chris looked up, horrified. "What? How?" The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his phone and made a call. Within an hour, the police were on the scene of the crime. Judge Perkins had already fed them a lead. A young black man, Jamal Carter, had been seen in the area around the time of the murder. The setup unfolded quickly. Perkins used his influence to ensure that evidence was found near Jamal's home, a bloodied pipe matching the murder weapon. A witness was coerced into identifying Jamal as the man they saw arguing with Darnell. The police, eager to close the case, didn't question the evidence. When they brought Jamal in for questioning, the young man was confused and terrified. "I don't know anything about this," he insisted, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Hours of relentless interrogation broke him down. The detectives pushed harder, feeding him details of the crime until he was too exhausted to fight back. "If you confess, you might get a lighter sentence," one of them lied. Jamal finally cracked under the pressure. "Fine," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. "I did it. Just stop." With his coerced confession in hand, the police declared the case solved. Chris breathed a sigh of relief, but the guilt lingered like a shadow. Judge Perkins, however, convinced himself that it was a necessary sacrifice, a means to protect his son and their family name. Little did they know, the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The sun was just rising when the pounding on the door startled the Carter family. Jamal's mother, Ruth Carter, rushed to open it, her heart sinking as she saw the police officers standing on the porch. Their faces were grim, and their presence was intimidating. "Is Jamal Carter here?" one of them asked, his tone sharp. Ruth turned to see Jamal emerging from his room, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, confusion etched on his face. "You're under arrest for the murder of Darnell Harris," the officer announced, stepping forward to handcuff him. "What? Murder?" Ruth cried out, stepping between the officers and her son. "There's no way my boy did this. You've got the wrong person." The officers ignored her protests, roughly pulling Jamal toward the door. "Mom, I didn't do it. I swear I didn't do anything," Jamal shouted, panic rising in his voice. Ruth grabbed the officer's arm. "Please, let him go. He's innocent." But they shoved her aside, and she fell to the floor, tears streaming down her face as she watched them take her son away. News of Jamal's arrest spread quickly. The media latched onto the story, painting him as a dangerous criminal before the trial even began. Images of him in handcuffs were plastered across every news channel, fueling public outrage. In the neighborhood, the community was torn. Some believed Jamal had been set up, knowing his reputation as a kind and hard-working young man. Others whispered that he might have had a hidden dark side, swayed by the sensational headlines. Ruth, however, refused to stay silent. "My son is innocent," she cried at a hastily arranged press conference outside her home. "This is a miscarriage of justice, and I won't rest until the truth comes out." But her pleas were drowned out by the media frenzy. Reporters twisted her words, focusing more on the spectacle than the facts. Ruth's heart ached as she realized how small her voice seemed against the powerful machine working to destroy her son's life. Meanwhile, Jamal sat in a cold, dimly lit jail cell, replaying the moment of his arrest over and over in his mind. How had his life come to this? Little did he know, this was only the beginning of his nightmare. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Jamal Carter's trial. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised to craft sensational headlines. Ruth Carter sat in the front, her hands clasped tightly, silently praying for her son's deliverance. Jamal's public defender, Mr. Ellis, shuffled his papers nervously. Overworked and underpaid, he had barely reviewed Jamal's case, let alone prepared a strong defense. Across the room, the prosecution team, led by an ambitious district attorney, was armed with a meticulously constructed narrative designed to convict. From the outset, it was clear the trial was a farce. The prosecution presented the pipe as the murder weapon, claiming it had Jamal's fingerprints. The bloody piece of evidence was waved dramatically before the jury, eliciting gasps. "This is the weapon Jamal Carter used to brutally murder Darnell Harris," the prosecutor declared, pointing at Jamal. "A violent criminal who thought he could get away with murder." Ellis feebly objected. "Your Honor, we have reason to question the authenticity of this evidence." But Judge Perkins, sitting high on the bench, quickly overruled him. "Move along, counselor," he said, his tone clipped. The prosecution brought in a so-called eyewitness who claimed to have seen Jamal near the scene of the crime. The witness fumbled under cross-examination, unable to provide consistent details, but Ellis failed to capitalize on it. His questioning lacked precision, and his closing arguments were scattered and unconvincing. Meanwhile, the media amplified the prosecution's narrative, painting Jamal as a violent thug. Old photos of him from his teenage years were dug up and plastered across newspapers, framing him as a delinquent. The jury, already predisposed to bias, absorbed these stories as if they were facts. Judge Perkins ensured the trial stayed on a course toward conviction. He shut down every attempt by the defense to introduce doubts about the evidence. His calm exterior betrayed none of the guilt that festered beneath the surface, a guilt he buried under the guise of justice. By the time the closing arguments were made, the outcome felt inevitable. The prosecution's final words rang out with cold precision. "The evidence is clear. Jamal Carter is guilty of murder, and he must face the consequences." The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all charges. Jamal stood as the verdict was read, his face a mask of disbelief. He glanced back at his mother, who broke down in tears, her cries piercing the courtroom. Ruth's world crumbled as the judge sentenced her son to life in prison. As the gavel struck, sealing Jamal's fate, Judge Perkins avoided looking at him. Deep down, the judge knew the truth, but his son's freedom had come at the cost of an innocent man's life. The system had played its role, corrupted and merciless, leaving Jamal to bear the weight of a crime he didn't commit. Jamal Carter entered the cold, steel gates of the prison with a heavy heart, his wrists bound by chains that felt like the weight of the world. The towering walls and echoing clang of cell doors were a harsh reminder that his life had been stripped away. His first days inside were a blur of fear and confusion. The stares of hardened inmates followed him everywhere, their eyes sizing him up. A confrontation in the yard made it clear that he would need to defend himself, but Jamal had never been a fighter. He avoided trouble as best he could, but the tension was suffocating. Loneliness became his constant companion. Locked in his tiny cell for hours, Jamal's thoughts were consumed by the injustice of his situation. He replayed the trial over and over, questioning how the world could be so cruel. Letters from his mother were his only solace, her words a lifeline reminding him that he wasn't forgotten. The guards showed no mercy, treating him with the same disdain as the most dangerous criminals. Every day felt like a battle, against the system, against the other inmates, and against his own despair. Jamal found a small glimmer of hope when he met Mr. Malcolm, an older inmate who had spent decades behind bars. Malcolm shared advice, warning him about the dangers of the prison hierarchy while encouraging him to stay strong. "Survive today," Malcolm often said, "one day at a time." But despite Malcolm's guidance, the crushing weight of 20 years stretched endlessly before him. Jamal lay awake most nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he would endure a punishment for a crime he didn't commit. Back at home, Ruth Carter refused to let despair consume her. Determined to prove her son's innocence, she spent her days writing letter after letter to anyone she thought could help: lawyers, activists, journalists, and even politicians. Her small kitchen table became her workspace, cluttered with envelopes, stamps, and newspapers. "Please, look into my son's case," she wrote tirelessly, pouring her heart into every plea. "He is an innocent man who was wrongfully convicted." Weeks turned into months, but the responses were always the same: polite rejections or, worse, silence. Ruth's faith in the system wavered, but her love for Jamal kept her going. She attended local events, trying to speak to anyone with influence, but her voice was drowned out in a world that seemed indifferent to her pain. The financial burden also took its toll. Between legal fees and the cost of sending money to Jamal in prison, Ruth struggled to make ends meet. Yet she worked extra shifts and sacrificed whatever she could to support him, her determination unyielding. Despite the lack of progress, Ruth held on to hope. Every letter she sent, every conversation she had, was a step closer to the truth. "I will not stop," she whispered to herself at night, clutching Jamal's photo. "One day, someone will listen." Unbeknownst to her, those letters would one day fall into the hands of the right person. But for now, Ruth's fight continued, fueled by a mother's unwavering love and a belief that justice would eventually prevail. Life behind bars had worn Jamal down, but one day, during a quiet moment in the prison library, he crossed paths with Mr. Malcolm, a gray-haired inmate with a calm demeanor. Malcolm had spent decades in prison and earned a reputation for his wisdom and patience. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," Malcolm said, sitting across from Jamal. His words were gentle but probing, cutting through Jamal's defenses. Jamal hesitated before opening up about his wrongful conviction. Malcolm listened intently, nodding occasionally. "You know," Malcolm said after a long pause, "they got me too. Different circumstances, but same story. That's why I learned the law. If you can't fight from the outside, you fight from within." Intrigued, Jamal asked questions, and Malcolm shared what he had learned over the years. He taught Jamal how to access legal texts, read court documents, and understand the system that had betrayed him. "Knowledge is power, son," Malcolm often said. "Don't let them keep you in the dark." For the first time in years, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Nights that were once filled with despair became opportunities for study. With Malcolm's guidance, he began poring over case law, searching for errors in his trial and ways to reopen his case. Though the path ahead was uncertain, Jamal clung to this newfound purpose. The fight for his innocence was no longer just a distant dream. It was something he could begin working toward, one page at a time. Judge Walter Perkins sat alone in his study, the amber liquid in his glass swirling as he stared into the darkness. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. It was the same drink he poured every night, hoping it would dull the guilt gnawing at his conscience, but it never worked. Images of Jamal Carter's anguished face flashed in his mind, accompanied by the echoes of the young man's pleas. "I didn't do it." The judge's decision to protect his son had saved Chris, but left an innocent man condemned. The weight of his actions was a shadow that followed him everywhere. His relationship with his family grew strained. Walter became distant and irritable, snapping at his wife over trivial matters. "You've been so cold lately," she remarked one evening, her voice heavy with concern. He brushed her off, retreating to his study as he always did. Meanwhile, Chris continued his carefree life, blissfully unaware of the toll his father was paying. He partied with friends, traveled, and squandered money as if nothing had happened. Every time Walter saw his son laughing without a care in the world, it was like salt in an open wound. On nights when sleep wouldn't come, Walter often stood by the window, staring out into the quiet streets. Did I do the right thing? He asked himself, knowing there was no answer that could bring him peace. The walls of his once perfect life were starting to crumble, and deep down, Judge Perkins knew it was only a matter of time before the truth broke free, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. After years of relentless study and preparation, Jamal Carter finally felt ready to challenge his conviction. Guided by the knowledge he had gained and the encouragement of Mr. Malcolm, he filed an appeal, arguing that his trial had been unfair and the evidence against him unreliable. The process was grueling. Jamal meticulously wrote his arguments, citing case law and pointing out inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. He submitted the appeal with a flicker of hope, believing the truth would finally come to light. Months passed before he received a response. When the letter arrived, his hands trembled as he tore it open, his heart pounding with anticipation. The words inside crushed him. Appeal denied. The court dismissed his claims without a hearing, citing a lack of compelling evidence. Jamal felt the air leave his lungs as he reread the letter, each word like a hammer blow. The same system that had convicted him refused to even consider his pleas. "You did everything right," Malcolm said, trying to console him. "The system is rigged, but this isn't the end." But for Jamal, it felt like it was. The rejection was more than a legal setback. It was a confirmation of his worst fear, that the truth didn't matter. That night, he sat alone in his cell, the weight of injustice pressing down on him harder than ever. For a moment, the hope he had clung to for years seemed like a cruel illusion. But deep inside, a small spark remained, refusing to be extinguished. One day, they'll have to hear me, he thought, though the path ahead seemed darker than ever. Years passed, and Chris Perkins grew into adulthood, but the privileges that shielded him could not protect him from his own recklessness. With no accountability for his actions, he spiraled into a life of excess, partying, gambling, and drinking away the guilt he refused to confront. Mounting debt and substance abuse began to catch up with him. Chris often drowned his shame in liquor, stumbling from one bar to another. On a particularly drunken night, he found himself in the company of an old friend, Jake, who had been his partner in countless reckless escapades. Between slurred words and the haze of alcohol, Chris muttered, "You know, I did something bad once. Real bad. My dad, he fixed it for me. Covered it up, saved my ass." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about, man?" Chris leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That murder years ago. The one they pinned on that black guy, Jamal or whatever. It wasn't him. It was me." Jake froze, stunned by the confession, but Chris passed out before he could say more. The drunken words, however, stayed with Jake, lingering like a shadow of something far more sinister. Jake couldn't shake Chris' confession. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of what he had heard began to eat at him. Finally, he decided to share it with someone who could investigate the truth, a local journalist, Tina Ramirez. Known for her sharp instincts and fearless reporting, Tina was always looking for stories that exposed corruption. Jake recounted Chris' words to Tina, who listened intently, her pen scratching across her notepad. "Are you absolutely sure he said that?" she pressed. "I'm telling you, Tina," he admitted it. "He said his dad covered it up." Intrigued but skeptical, Tina began digging into Jamal Carter's case. What she found was disturbing. Inconsistencies in the evidence, questionable witness testimonies, and a suspiciously rushed trial. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Jamal might have been framed. Tina decided to take the story further. She reached out to Jamal's mother, Ruth Carter, who was hesitant at first but eventually shared everything she had been fighting for over the years. Armed with Ruth's testimony and her growing pile of evidence, Tina knew she was onto something explosive. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Judge Perkins was a powerful man, and challenging the system that had protected him would come with consequences. Still, Tina couldn't ignore the injustice staring her in the face. The truth had to come out. Judge Walter Perkins first heard whispers of Tina Ramirez's investigation during a private conversation with an old colleague. "A journalist's been sniffing around Jamal Carter's case," the man warned. "She's asking a lot of uncomfortable questions." Panic surged through Walter. His carefully constructed facade, the one that had shielded his family for years, was beginning to crack. That night, he couldn't sleep. The thought of his son's drunken confession and the journalist's probing questions gnawed at him. What if she finds out the truth? Desperate to protect his family, Walter arranged a private meeting with Tina. In a dimly lit cafe, he sat across from her, his usually commanding demeanor replaced by unease. "Ms. Ramirez," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I've heard you're looking into Jamal Carter's case. I'd advise you to let it go. The matter has been settled for years." Tina leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking on his. "Settled? Or covered up?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Walter's jaw tightened. "There are consequences for digging into the past, Ms. Ramirez. I suggest you think about what's at stake." But Tina wasn't easily intimidated. "You seem awfully concerned about an old case, Your Honor," she said, standing to leave. "I'll let the facts speak for themselves." As she walked away, Walter's hands trembled. His guilt, long buried beneath years of justification, rose to the surface like a poison. He retreated to his study that night, pouring himself another drink, haunted by the inevitability of his sins catching up to him. Tina Ramirez wasn't one to back down. Armed with her research, she decided to confront Chris Perkins directly. She found him at a local bar, nursing a drink in the dim glow of neon lights. He looked older than his years, the toll of his reckless lifestyle evident in his tired eyes. "Chris Perkins?" Tina asked, sliding into the seat across from him. "Who's asking?" he replied, his voice slurred but defensive. Tina placed a recorder on the table and leaned in. "I know about the murder, Chris. I know about Jamal Carter. And I know your father helped you cover it up." Chris froze, the color draining from his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, looking away. "Lying won't help you," Tina pressed. "An innocent man has spent 20 years in prison because of what you and your father did. It's time to make it right." For a moment, Chris was silent, his hands gripping his glass tightly. Then, with a deep sigh, he muttered, "It was a mistake. A stupid, drunken mistake. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." Tina pushed the recorder closer. "Say it clearly. Say what really happened." Chris hesitated, then began to speak, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. He confessed to everything, the argument, the murder, and his father's role in framing Jamal. By the time he finished, his shoulders sagged as though a heavy burden had been lifted. "I'll cooperate," Chris said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just promise me it'll make a difference." Tina nodded, knowing this confession was the turning point in the fight for Jamal's freedom. With Chris on board, the stage was set for a legal battle that would expose the truth at last. Tina Ramirez wasted no time after Chris's confession. She contacted attorney Marcus Reed, a renowned civil rights lawyer known for taking on high-profile wrongful conviction cases. When she played Chris's recorded confession, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "This is huge," he said, "but it won't be easy. The system will do everything to protect Judge Perkins." With Chris's cooperation and the inconsistencies Tina had uncovered, Marcus filed a motion to reopen Jamal Carter's case. The evidence was damning. The coerced confession, planted weapon, and now a first-hand admission of guilt from the real perpetrator. But as expected, the legal system pushed back. Judges and prosecutors hesitated to touch the case, citing insufficient grounds for retrial despite the clear evidence. Behind the scenes, whispers of influence and favors protecting Judge Perkins were hard to ignore. "This isn't just about Jamal," Marcus told Tina. "This is about exposing corruption at the highest level. They'll fight us every step of the way." Undeterred, Marcus and Tina prepared for a legal war. They knew the road ahead would be long, but the truth was finally on their side, and they weren't about to back down. The call from Tina Ramirez came late one evening as Ruth Carter sat by the window, staring at a faded photograph of her son. "Mrs. Carter," Tina said, her voice steady but urgent. "We have new evidence that could clear Jamal's name." Ruth nearly dropped the phone. "New evidence? After all these years?" "Yes," Tina confirmed, "and we're working with Marcus Reed. We believe we can get Jamal's case reopened." For the first time in decades, Ruth felt hope surge in her chest. She immediately joined forces with Tina and Marcus, sharing every detail she had about Jamal's case and rallying the local community. Word spread quickly, and soon, the story was making headlines. New evidence in 20-year-old murder case sparks outrage. Protests erupted across the city. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Jamal. Signs reading, "Free Jamal" and "Justice for the wrongfully convicted" filled the streets. Ruth became a symbol of resilience, speaking at rallies and pleading for her son's release on national television. As public pressure mounted, the legal system could no longer ignore the case. The fight was far from over, but Ruth felt a sense of vindication. The world was finally listening, and for the first time in years, she believed Jamal might come home. The pressure was unbearable. Judge Walter Perkins sat alone in his study, the walls seeming to close in around him. The media storm around Jamal Carter's case grew louder every day, and whispers of his involvement in the cover-up began to circulate in legal circles. Colleagues avoided eye contact, and his once unshakable reputation started to crumble. His wife, Margaret Perkins, confronted him one evening. "Walter," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to know the truth. Did you frame that boy to protect Chris?" Walter didn't answer at first, staring into his glass of whiskey. "I did what I had to," he finally admitted, his voice hollow. "To protect this family." Margaret's face twisted in disbelief and anger. "You destroyed another family to save ours? How could you?" The confrontation broke what little resolve Walter had left. His guilt, buried for decades, consumed him. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, and spent his days drowning in alcohol. The proud, commanding judge was now a shadow of his former self, haunted by the knowledge that his actions were about to be exposed. When the retrial was finally granted, Chris Perkins reluctantly agreed to testify. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the community who had followed Jamal Carter's case for years. The tension in the air was palpable. Chris took the stand, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone. He avoided looking at his parents, seated in the back row. His father's expression was one of defeat. His mother's, a mix of heartbreak and anger. Under questioning by attorney Marcus Reed, Chris recounted the night of the murder. His voice cracked as he confessed to striking Darnell Harris and fleeing the scene. "I panicked," he admitted. "And my dad, he covered it up. He made it look like Jamal did it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The revelation was shocking not just because of Chris's actions, but because it implicated Judge Perkins, a man once revered for his commitment to justice. The confession sent shockwaves through the nation. News outlets ran headlines like, "Judge's son confesses to murder, implicates father in cover-up." The Perkins family was divided, their legacy shattered. Margaret stormed out of the courtroom, unable to look at her husband or son. For Jamal, it was a moment of bittersweet vindication. The truth was finally out, but it had come at a cost. The fight for justice wasn't over yet, but Chris's testimony was the turning point that would change everything. The reopening of Jamal Carter's case drew national attention, with every major news outlet covering the proceedings. The courtroom was filled with reporters, activists, and supporters wearing pins that read, "Justice for Jamal." Attorney Marcus Reed presented the overwhelming evidence of Jamal's innocence. The recording of Chris Perkins' confession was played for the court, followed by testimonies exposing the planted weapon and coerced confession. Tina Ramirez's investigative findings painted a clear picture of police misconduct, fueled by systemic bias and Judge Perkins' influence. The prosecution had little defense. The planted evidence crumbled under scrutiny, and key witnesses admitted they had been pressured into lying. As the truth unraveled, the courtroom was gripped with tension. Finally, Marcus stood before the jury, his voice steady but impassioned. Jamal Carter has spent 20 years of his life locked away for a crime he did not commit. This case is not just about his freedom. It is about restoring faith in our justice system. When the jury returned their verdict, the words, "not guilty," rang out, bringing tears to Jamal's eyes. The gavel slammed, signaling the end of the nightmare that had consumed 2 decades of his life. The day of Jamal's release was a moment of pure emotion. As he walked out of the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Supporters held signs reading, "Welcome home," and chanted his name. Inside the courtroom, Ruth Carter stood waiting. When she saw her son step through the doors, her tears flowed freely. "My baby," she whispered, her voice trembling as she threw her arms around him. Jamal held her tightly, the years of pain and separation melting away in their embrace. The courtroom was filled with sobs and applause, even from some jurors and spectators who had followed the case closely. Marcus Reed and Tina Ramirez stood nearby, proud of the fight they had waged for justice. Jamal looked around, taking in the moment. For the first time in 20 years, he felt the warmth of freedom. But more than that, he felt the love and resilience of a community that had fought tirelessly to bring him home. As mother and son walked out into the sunlight together, Jamal whispered, "We made it, Mama. We made it." Ruth smiled, holding his hand tightly. "No, baby," she replied, her voice filled with strength. "You made it." The journey was far from over, but for Jamal, this was the beginning of a new chapter. A life reclaimed and a justice system forever changed by his story. The fallout from the reopened case was swift and unforgiving. Judge Walter Perkins, once a symbol of integrity and fairness, became the face of corruption and injustice. Under mounting pressure, he announced his resignation from the bench, his voice hollow as he addressed the media. "I deeply regret my actions and the pain they have caused," he said, though his words rang empty. Legal proceedings were soon launched against Perkins for his role in framing Jamal Carter. Prosecutors detailed how he had abused his power to manipulate evidence and obstruct justice. The courtroom where he had once presided became the place where his own guilt was laid bare. The verdict was harsh but just, a prison sentence for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. As Walter was led away in handcuffs, he avoided the eyes of the reporters and former colleagues who had once admired him. His name, once spoken with respect, was now synonymous with betrayal. For Jamal, the judge's downfall was a bittersweet moment. "It doesn't give me back the years I lost," he said during a televised interview. "But it proves that no one is above the law." Chris Perkins, racked with guilt, sought a way to make amends. After the trial, he reached out to Jamal through attorney Marcus Reed. The meeting was tense at first, with Jamal's eyes cold as he faced the man whose actions had stolen 2 decades of his life. "I don't expect forgiveness," Chris began, his voice trembling. "But I need you to know, I'm sorry. I was a coward. And because of me, you lost everything." Jamal's silence was heavy, but eventually he nodded. "You're right. I did lose everything. But maybe now you can do something with what you have left." Determined to honor Jamal's words, Chris used his privilege and connections to advocate for criminal justice reform. He joined organizations fighting wrongful convictions and spoke publicly about his role in the tragedy, hoping his story would serve as a cautionary tale. Though the wounds between them would never fully heal, Chris's actions became a small step toward redemption. He dedicated his life to helping others avoid the same fate, carrying the weight of his guilt as a reminder of the cost of silence and privilege. Freedom felt strange to Jamal Carter. The world he re-entered was not the one he had left 20 years ago. Technology, culture, even the faces in his neighborhood, all had changed. Walking down the street felt surreal, like he was an outsider in a life that no longer belonged to him. Jamal struggled to find work. Employers hesitated when they saw the gaps in his history or learned of his conviction, even though he'd been exonerated. Nights were often restless, haunted by memories of his time behind bars, the clang of cell doors, the echo of voices in the dark. His relationships also bore the weight of his incarceration. Conversations with old friends felt stilted, and he struggled to connect with people who hadn't lived through what he had. Only his mother, Ruth, seemed to truly understand, her unwavering support a steady anchor. But even Ruth's love couldn't erase the scars. Jamal battled bouts of anger and despair, questioning how to rebuild a life stolen from him. Despite the challenges, he resolved to keep moving forward. "I didn't survive 20 years in hell to give up now," he often told himself, clinging to hope as his guiding light. Ruth Carter couldn't let her son's ordeal be for nothing. Determined to fight for others who might be suffering the same injustice, she used her voice and the growing public support to launch the Jamal Carter Foundation. Its mission was clear: to help the wrongfully convicted and their families find justice and healing. The foundation quickly gained traction, drawing support from activists, lawyers, and ordinary people inspired by Jamal's story. Ruth worked tirelessly, hosting fundraisers, speaking at events, and meeting with families whose loved ones had been incarcerated unfairly. "This isn't just about Jamal," Ruth said during the foundation's launch event. "It's about every mother, every family, fighting for a son or daughter who didn't deserve what happened to them." Through her efforts, the foundation helped overturn several wrongful convictions, providing hope and relief to countless families. Ruth's legacy grew beyond her role as a mother. She became a symbol of resilience and justice, proving that even in the darkest times, love and determination could light the way forward. As she worked to help others, Ruth often looked at Jamal with pride. "Your fight gave me my purpose," she told him one day, her voice full of warmth. "And together, we'll make sure no one else suffers like you did." The exoneration of Jamal Carter sparked a firestorm of public outrage. Across the nation, protests erupted, with crowds chanting, "Justice for Jamal," and holding signs that read, "End wrongful convictions and accountability now." Social media was flooded with calls for change, and Jamal's case became a rallying cry for those demanding reform in the criminal justice system. Activist groups organized marches, while lawmakers faced intense pressure to address systemic issues that allowed cases like Jamal's to happen. News outlets ran exposés on corruption in the judicial system, highlighting how racial bias and flawed investigations had derailed countless lives. In response to the mounting outcry, several states introduced new legislation aimed at preventing wrongful convictions. Policies were proposed to increase transparency in police investigations, ensure proper legal representation for defendants, and establish review boards for questionable cases. The movement gained momentum, with the public demanding not just justice for Jamal, but sweeping reform to prevent others from suffering the same fate. His story had become a symbol of resilience and the urgent need for accountability in a broken system. Jamal Carter, once a victim of injustice, found a new calling: advocacy. With the support of the Jamal Carter Foundation and his mother's encouragement, he began sharing his story at events, universities, and rallies. His words were raw and powerful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the need for systemic change. Standing before crowds, Jamal spoke of the pain of losing 20 years of his life, but also of the hope that had kept him going. "I'm not just here for me," he often said. "I'm here for every person still behind bars for a crime they didn't commit." His story resonated deeply, inspiring others to join the fight for justice. Law students, activists, and even former prisoners reached out to him, eager to be part of the movement. Jamal's presence became a force for change, his words a reminder that one voice could spark a revolution. Though the scars of his incarceration remained, Jamal found healing in his purpose. Each life he touched, each story he heard, became a step toward rebuilding the life he had lost. He knew the fight for justice would be long, but he was ready to lead the charge. The community that had once been torn apart by Jamal's conviction began to come together in the wake of his exoneration. Neighbors who had once whispered in doubt about his innocence now came forward with apologies and offers of support. Churches organized fundraisers to help Jamal rebuild his life, while local businesses donated goods and services. A mural honoring Jamal's resilience was painted on the side of a community center, depicting him standing tall, with the words, "Justice prevails," written beneath. At a neighborhood gathering, Ruth Carter addressed the crowd, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "We were divided for too long," she said. "But this is our chance to come together, not just for Jamal, but for every young man and woman who deserves a fair chance." Jamal, too, felt the shift. People he once avoided now greeted him with open arms. Though the scars of his ordeal remained, the support of his community became a source of strength. Slowly but surely, the rift that had formed over 2 decades began to heal, proving that even in the face of great injustice, unity and compassion could prevail. In a dimly lit studio, Judge Walter Perkins sat across from a reporter, his face lined with regret. The interview had been his decision, a final attempt to make amends, though he knew it would never undo the harm he had caused. "I knew it was wrong," Perkins admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. "But I was blinded by fear for my son. I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was destroy another." The reporter leaned forward. "Do you think justice was served in Jamal Carter's case?" Perkins lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly. "No," he said quietly. "Justice failed him. I failed him, and I will live with that for the rest of my life." The confession sent shockwaves through the public. Some viewed it as a long overdue acknowledgement of guilt, while others saw it as too little, too late. The damage was irreparable. Jamal's 20 years were gone, and the Perkins family's legacy lay in ruins. For Jamal, the confession was bittersweet. It validated the truth he had fought so hard to prove, but it also reminded him of the profound cost of the judge's actions. In the end, Perkins' words were just that, words. The true justice had come from the perseverance of those who refused to let the truth stay buried. Jamal Carter poured his soul into his memoir, Buried Truth, My Fight for Justice. Page by page, he recounted the pain of his wrongful conviction, the years lost behind bars, and the resilience it took to reclaim his life. It was a story of suffering but also of hope, a call to action for a nation grappling with systemic injustice. When the book was released, it quickly climbed the bestseller lists. Readers from all walks of life connected with Jamal's journey, and his words ignited a nationwide conversation about race, wrongful convictions, and the flaws in the justice system. Interviews, book signings, and speaking engagements followed. Jamal's voice grew louder, reaching not just those affected by injustice, but also those in positions to enact change. "This isn't just my story," he said during a televised interview. "It's the story of thousands who are still waiting for their voices to be heard." The proceeds from the book supported the Jamal Carter Foundation, funding legal aid for other wrongfully convicted individuals. Jamal's triumph was more than personal. It became a beacon of hope for countless others. Under a clear sky, Jamal Carter stood on a brightly lit stage, facing a massive crowd. The audience, a diverse sea of faces, hung on his every word. His story had brought them here, not just to hear about his past, but to find inspiration for the future. 20 years ago, Jamal began, his voice steady. "I stood in a courtroom, accused of something I didn't do. I lost my freedom, my time, and almost my hope. But what they couldn't take from me was my belief in justice, even when it seemed impossible." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jamal raised his hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. About building a system that values truth over power, fairness over bias, and humanity over fear." Tears glistened in Ruth Carter's eyes as she watched from the front row, her heart swelling with pride. The boy she had fought so hard for had grown into a man who was changing the world. Jamal ended his speech with a simple yet powerful message. "We can't rewrite the past, but we can fight for a better future together." As the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation, Jamal smiled, knowing that this was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you.